present you Nicolas de Warren. He's our guest today, and he's going to give us a talk about this subject. With such a stuff, dreams are made on, a narrative, Oneiric imagination. I would like to, or I have the idea to play this song, the very famous song, Sweet Dreams. Yeah, but I forgot. Sorry. Well, yeah, Eurythmics. Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, it's a pleasure to introduce Nicolas de Warren. He's one of the best specialists in technology, and he also works in so many different fields of philosophy, in ethics, and also in aesthetics and in political philosophy. And he also is the author of different books. His last work, if I'm right, is German philosophy and the First World War. He's actually working in other projects now, but that's one of his last books. Also, Original Forgiveness, for example, is a very interesting and very known book in the philosophical field. Also, his first book, Husserl and the Progress of Time, Subjectivity and Transcendental Technology, which is, in my opinion, a classic on the subject. And well, we are now to listen to him and to discuss with him about this topic. So, with any else, I'm not going to say anything else. We give you the how to say
the floor,
the floor,
or the word,
and yeah, please, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much, Ignacio, and thank you also for the opportunity and the invitation to come here and to speak to you here in Puebla. So, what I thought I would do today is to, since I know many of you are interested in phenomenology and in different aspects, different approaches, is to try to elaborate an idea that Jean-Paul Sartre proposes in his book on the imaginary, l'imaginaire, where he makes this quite, on the one hand, I think very intuitive claim, but at the same time extremely puzzling to just think through and figure out, where he proposes that dreams are intrinsically narrative. And if you are familiar with different theories of dreams, especially in the 20th century, Freudian, Lacanian, whatever, cognitive science, it's really an exceptional position to take. Freud thinks that dreams are intrinsically not narratives, they're only narratively constructed in the process of wakeful life and remembrance, just to give one classic example. So I always thought that this suggestion that dreams are intrinsically, they're structured as narratives, is on the one hand, I think, deeply intuitive because we all dream. I'm sure you had dreams last night. And we all have a kind of intuitive sense that dreams, what captivates us about the dreams, especially the dreams that we feel we need to tell others or recount, is that there's something like little stories. There's something's going on. So on the one hand, it seems to be very intuitive. I think we would all immediately say that sounds really plausible. But then, if you really think about it, how do you unpack that claim and really develop it? Let's call it philosophically, phenomenologically, it's extremely complicated. So what I'm going to try to do is to try to take this idea seriously. Sartre, if you're familiar with that discussion, and I'll go through it in some detail, it's a very compressed discussion. It's maybe 1 or 2 pages. So I'm going to try to elaborate and sort of try to justify, if you wish, make sense of that insight, while at the same time trying to see what makes it so puzzling and complex as an insight. And then, towards the end, I'm going to propose sort of the limitations to this insight, that maybe it doesn't capture everything that we might want to say or think about dreams. And if that wasn't ambitious enough, because you need ambition in philosophy, I'm going to also try to use this attempt to make sense, in English I would say to puzzle out this suggestion, as a way also to contribute to a very contemporary debate in phenomenology. And that's a debate about whether consciousness, and more specifically the structure of what it is to be conscious of oneself as a self, is fundamentally has a narrative structure or not. As you know, many philosophers, and I'll go through it very briefly, Hannah Arendt, Paul Ricoeur argue that there is a narrative structure of the self, that the self, what it is to be a self and to be aware of oneself as a self is to be able to tell a story about oneself. On the other hand, you have other philosophers, Dan Zahavi being perhaps the most influential or famous one, or if you're familiar with the British philosopher Galen Strawson, who's an interesting analytic philosopher, but who's very interested in phenomenology, and others. But Galen Strawson, Dan Zahavi, especially Galen Strawson, I'll talk about Galen Strawson, explicitly argue that consciousness does not have an intrinsic narrative self. Instead, they argue that it's an episodic structure. So this is the terminology of the debate, narrative or episodic. So I'm going to try to show that what is interesting philosophically about Sartre's thesis, let's call it Sartre's hypothesis, dreams are intrinsically narrative, is that it presents an interesting example that changes the terms of the debate between episodic and narrative. So the way in which that debate is formulated, I think, doesn't take into account the possibility that dreams could be narrative, though dreams are episodic experiences. I mean, that's going to be the basic kind of strategy. So that's the other sort of issue that I'm interested in. So that's sort of to give you, as I would say in English, the sort of the lay of the land. And that's sort of what I thought I would explore with you today. So let me just start with some very general remarks that, as I'm sure you're aware of, the oldest literature across human cultures attests to the entanglement of dreams and storytelling. In ancient Chinese culture, as well as ancient Mesopotamian civilizations, which are the two oldest civilizations for which we still have written documents, dreams were taken to have various meanings. So in these cultures, ancient Chinese cultures, they were either understood as portending the future, so predicting the future, as divination, so like an oracle, communication with deities and spirits, symbolism in need of deciphering, journey to immortal lands or to regions of the dead. So there really is a tremendous diversity of interpretations of what dreams are. And in a classic Chinese dream manual from the 11th century BCE, called the Duke Zhao's Interpretation of Dreams, it's a very classical Chinese text about dreams from the 11th century BCE, so before Common Era. Dreams are organized into thematic sections, such as one section is dragon and snakes, food and drink, spouses, childbirth, pregnancy, and sex. And under these classification, it's a kind of dream symbolism. Apparently, under food and drink, if you dream seeing yourself dressed in white, it means that somebody's plotting against you. So if tonight you have a dream and you see you're wearing a white shirt, then, I don't know, maybe someone's trying to do something against you, according to the Duke of Zhao from the 11th century BCE. In perhaps what is the most celebrated dream story or episode from Chinese culture, this is Zhuangzi's butterfly dream. I'm sure you all know this. Zhuangzi dreamt that he was a butterfly, wakes up and doesn't know if it was Zhuangzhu, his full name is Zhuangzi Zhao, who had dreamt that he was a butterfly, or whether he was a butterfly dreaming that he was Zhuangzi Zhao. In some later Chinese text about dreams, you have the idea that in addition to these classical tropes of dreams as symbolism, you start to have the idea that dreams carry another dimension of meaning, which is directly connected to the person who is dreaming, that dreams reveal something about the dreamer that escapes the dreamer. And in the Western literary tradition, the oldest dream narratives also attest to this entanglement of the dreamer and their own life and the dream that they're having. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the oldest, let's call it Western, if you want to call it Western, text, dreams possess a variety of meaning and functions. I mean, dreams are all over in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And in one of the tablets, as you know, the Epic of Gilgamesh is not organized by chapters, it's organized by the cuneiform tablets that tell the story. Gilgamesh experiences a sequence of puzzling dreams. Unable to make sense of these apparitions, he turns to his mother, Ninsun is her name, who then interprets the dreams for him, and one of the dreams she interprets as announcing the arrival of his friend Enkidu, which indeed in the story he eventually meets. So these are just some examples to show that in the most ancient literary records that give testimony to the capacity of dreaming, we have the entanglement between dreaming and storytelling. Not only the way in which dreams function in stories, but all the sense in which dreams themselves are catalysts for storytelling or themselves are stories. So I'm going to be interested in this connection between dreams as catalysts for storytelling, dreams as stories that are told to us, and dreams that function in stories. Because I think those are three distinct ways in which dreams operate or function. And as in Gilgamesh's omen dream, the dream where it's interpreted by his mother that he's going to meet this friend of his, Enkidu, dreams are here not only worthy of being spoken about, so there's something about the dream that I want to communicate and I want to speak about, but in need of telling to others, but that this need to tell my dream to others is part of me trying to tell the story of my own life, insofar that in the Gilgamesh epic, meeting Enkidu becomes one of the key episodes in the unfolding of Gilgamesh's own life. So in a sense, you might say that the opposition to live or to tell is perhaps not the question for dreams, but rather to live in telling and telling in living. So this is in English I call it the imbrication of to live in a form of telling and a telling that occurs in a living. This is exactly, dreams are precisely, in a sense, manifestations of that. So that we tell stories, recount our lives, and share in narrative exchanges, what we're doing every day. I drove here to Puebla, and all we did is talk about stories and tell about our lives. That there's something fundamentally human about recounting narratives, telling stories, etc. I think it's quite amazing that this doesn't simply preoccupy us and shape and signify our lives when we are awake, but even when we are dreaming, there is still some kind of storytelling occurring. So this is what I would say is telling, and I'm playing on the English word, that something is telling of something means that it's evidence for something. Also, I'm going to play a lot with English, because I want to make sure that's clear. If something is telling of something, it means that it bespeaks it and it gives evidence for it. So this telling of stories and narratives is itself telling of the existential significance of storytelling and the manifold ways in which dreams figure in literary narratives, as I just pointed to, both in the ancient Chinese context and in the Gilgamesh, accentuates what I call the nocturnal conspiracy between dreams and storytelling, but also the connection between narrativity and selfhood. So again, let me return to the Gilgamesh dream that he recounts to his mother. Gilgamesh recounts his dream to his mother, and with this telling of this dream to his mother, he solicits from his mother an understanding or the interpretation of a dream which he himself dreamt but cannot understand. So already there, the dream expands the scope, the limited scope of my self-understanding. I experience something which only I experience, but which I do not understand, and I need another to interpret that dream for me to understand myself. So he solicits an understanding of his dream. He asks his mother, what do you think this means? Which then in turn opens what I call in English a plot point. So a dramatic plot point in the unfolding life of his own narrative, which is precisely the unfolding plot of meeting Enkidu, and if you're familiar with Gilgamesh, the narrative, the quest for immortality. To give another just literary example, so this is just setting the stage, in perhaps the most famous entanglement of dreams and storytelling and living, it's in the Arabian Nights. If you're familiar with the Arabian Nights, Shahrazad or Scheherazade, depending on how it's translated, recounts a story time and again in order to forestall death. So storied nights, nights in which there are stories, allows us to continue and postpone death, as if, as Walter Benjamin, in a very beautiful essay he writes on the storyteller, that Walter Benjamin writes, death is the sanction of everything the storyteller can relate. So the capacity to tell stories about ourselves is also a relationship to death itself, to the finitude. And so that's going to just be to set up the question I'm going to ask, and you may have noticed from the poster, my title is a reference to Shakespeare. Of what stuffs are dreams made on? It's a direct quote from Shakespeare. Of what stuff is life made on? And it's interesting that in Shakespeare it's not made of, it's made on. Mm-hmm. So let's call it one way to just set up what I want to do. That, just to put it very simplistically, dreams are entangled in narratives, and that tells us something about the entanglement of what it is to have a life, be conscious of having a life, and storytelling. Let's call that the literary motivation for that set of issues. Now, in a more philosophical context, in a contemporary context, especially within contemporary phenomenological, or let's call it 20th century phenomenological continental philosophy, not even continental, just philosophy, as I mentioned right at the beginning, there are many, many accounts that have been provided for a narrative conception of the self. If you're familiar with Alistair MacIntyre, one of the most important Anglo-Saxon moral philosophers, Hannah Arendt, Paul Ricoeur, just to name three, or perhaps the most famous. Now, they have different accounts, but they're all committed to this idea of a narrative conception of the self. Mm-hmm. Within the phenomenological tradition, since I know many of you here work on phenomenology, you may have heard of a German philosopher called Hermann Lübbe. Hermann Lübbe admonished, so criticized classical phenomenology, this was back in the 50s, for what he called phenomenology's commitment to Platonism with regard to the self. I'm not saying that's a correct criticism, but that's what he claims, because he argues that selfhood is constituted through consciousness of one's own unique biography, and the way in which the ability to tell a story about myself allows me to accommodate into my life and give meaning contingencies that occur to my life. And another author within the phenomenological world who also proposed something like this is an author who our friend Daniela is very interested in, is Wilhelm Schaap, who wrote a book called in German In Geschichten verstrich, which means something like to be entangled or enmeshed in stories. So in this book, In Geschichte verstrich, Wilhelm Schaap proposes that stories, so Geschichten in German, should be regarded as an original phenomenon. He calls this an Urphänomen. That human existence is enmeshed and involved and entangled in stories, not only historical stories, but biographical stories as well. And just to give you one more author, Hannah Arendt and the Human Condition, and again they argue differently, but they have the same kind of point they want to make, argues that human life possesses a narrative form, as she writes, and here I'm quoting from the Human Condition, the chief characteristic of this specifically human life, so what makes human life what makes our life specifically human as opposed to just a life, is that, as she says, whose appearance and disappearance, namely that I'm born into the world and I disappear, is that one's life, quote, is full of events which ultimately can be told as a story, established biography. It is of this life, bios as distinguished from mere zoe, so two Greek terms in Aristotle for life, that consists in the narrative form of a life. And for her, the specificity of having a life, that telling stories about oneself, as much as being the subject of stories told about myself, has something to do with the fact that, if you wish, life is always constituted through actions. So it's the fact that we act, that therefore we tell stories in order to interpret our actions. And as Hannah Arendt argues, I am not simply the author of my life narrative. I'm also the subject of my life narrative, because after I leave Puebla, you might gossip about me and tell bad stories or what have you, or good stories. So there's a sense in which what it is to have a life is to be constituted by stories, not all of which are the stories that, in a sense, I authored for myself. And this is a very insightful distinction in Hannah Arendt between being the subject of my life story and being the author of my life story. Those are not the same. So this is the sense, again, and I'll just give you one more, just to show there's a rich tradition. This goes all the way back to Aristotle. And to Aristotle's discussion in the Poetics of Tragedy, where in Aristotle's very classical account, which all of these authors in one way or another draw on, what he calls a narrative renders intelligible the meaningful course of actions in terms of coherence and intelligibility, such that what motivates the intelligibility of a sequence of actions is always the capacity to ask the question, what comes next? So the difference between simply a sequence of things in time and a narrative sequence is, in a narrative sequence, I can always ask what comes next. And as you know, for Aristotle, this requires a unity of time between past, present, and future. And this is what he calls, in Greek, he calls mythos, which means emplotment. In English, it's called emplotment. So narrative form, as Aristotle argues, and this is what tragedy does. That's why tragedy is about action. You know, who killed the king of Thebes? Who's sleeping with the mother? You know, whatever. Narrative form does not only render intelligible action and give a configuration of meaning to life through action, but it's also the basic form in which we appear to each other, as well as not appear to each other. Because, of course, I can be concealed by narratives in the way that in Oedipus, Oedipus has a false narrative, has a false idea of who he is, tells a false story, and then learns his true story. So what's interesting here is that there are many accounts for a narrative conception of the self, but there's also arguments against this. And I'm just going to mention Galen Strawson. Galen Strawson has a really wonderful essay called Against Narrativity, where he really argues against all of these narrative theories. And it's also something he's developed in other work as well. So this idea that we constitute ourselves by understanding ourselves as narrative in form and living accordingly, and therefore the very structure of consciousness of oneself as having a life, or self-consciousness narrative, Galen Strawson argues that a narrative structure of life and consciousness of one life as a narrative, and the capacity to tell a narrative, presupposes a kind of minimal consciousness of oneself, what Dan Zahavi calls a minimal self, or Galen Strawson calls a minimal subject, or in phenomenological vocabulary, a pre-reflexive consciousness of oneself, which is intrinsically itself not narrative but episodic. Another author who would argue this is Husserl. I mean, Husserl thinks that the structure of inner time consciousness as pre-reflexive with retentions, potentions, gives a configuration to the unity of experience, but is not intrinsically narrative. So it's episodic. So in every act of experience, it's constituted temporally, and then it has to be reconstituted in the next act. So this is what Galen Strawson calls an episodic conception of consciousness, not consciousness as consciousness of myself as an I, but of me being conscious. So in phenomenological vocabulary, that's the difference between pre-reflexive consciousness and reflexive consciousness. So the argument here is that any account of a narrative conception of the self presupposes an episodic consciousness, and therefore the self is fundamentally not narrative. That's basically Galen Strawson's argument. So this is sort of just to set up now Sartre. So Sartre's account of dreaming in the imaginary, again, I think is exceptional for the reason that I introduced early on. It's going to suggest something which is quite unique in the literature on dreaming, that dreams are intrinsically narrative. But at the same time, it's also going to introduce a very different way to think about this debate between episodic consciousness and narrative consciousness. Because already to sort of tell you what the argument's going to be in a form, and then I'll go through the argument in detail, dream consciousness is on the one hand episodic, because it's pre-reflexive. But on the other hand, if Sartre's hypothesis is correct, it's narrative. So it would be something which seems to be impossible both for Galen Strawson and for Husserl, namely an episodic narrative consciousness. So that's what's philosophically interesting, I think, in Sartre's account. So here, I won't go through all of the details of it, but I'm going to first say a few things about how Sartre is going to propose that dream consciousness is a form of what he calls the imaginary, l'imaginaire in French, and how the structure of the l'imaginaire is itself manifold. There's many manifestations or form of l'imaginaire. And the most, if you wish, complete or self-enclosed, the most radical form of l'imaginaire is going to be dream consciousness. So if you're familiar with Sartre's book L'Imaginaire, the discussion of dream consciousness comes at the end. So he basically goes through different manifestations of dream consciousness and then arrives at he goes through different forms of the l'imaginaire and ends up with dream consciousness. The other thing that I'll mention, I guess I'm going to do this quickly because I want to focus on the analysis of dream, is Sartre, again, if you're familiar with the work, follows Husserl in arguing that l'imaginaire is a form of intentionality, it's a structure of intentionality, and that l'imaginaire in all of its forms cannot be conflated with perception. So in a sense, this breaks through what Sartre calls the illusion of immanence, meaning, according to Sartre, Husserl has the same kind of view, that traditional accounts about the imaginary, going back already to Aristotle's De Anima, the imaginary is always the production of an image which is internal to the mind or the soul. That when I imagine a unicorn, I entertain an image of the unicorn, and that this image of the unicorn only exists within my consciousness, within my mind. So here, Sartre argues that there are two prejudices or two problems with this account. One, the imaginary object as an intentional object does not have the form of an image. When I imagine Madame Bovary or a unicorn, that is different than looking at a picture or an image of Madame Bovary or a unicorn. For those of you who are familiar with Husserl, this is the difference in Husserl between Bilbewusstsein and Fantasie. That Fantasie is not a form of Bilbewusstsein. So Sartre makes the same argument. So in a sense, it ascribes a certain transcendence to the imaginary as an object, but precisely not an object that has the same constitution as a perceptual object. Because when I imagine Madame Bovary, I don't posit Madame Bovary as in this room. If I did think that Madame Bovary, or if I did perceive that all of a sudden, oh my God, Madame Bovary, the love of my life, enters into the room, then I would be hallucinating. Because hallucination is the positing of the imaginary in. So that's the first breakthrough of that immanence, that imaginary objects are transcendent objects. They're noematic objects in the Husserlian sense. And the second is that they are not images, and they are not also in the mind. They are not inconscious. They are transcendent objects in Sartre's and Husserl's thinking. So that's going to then set up the key framework to then understand what is specific about dreams as a form of the imaginary, without conflating dreams as a perception hallucination, but also not conflating dreams as other forms of the imaginary. Namely, if I'm right now reading a novel and imagining Madame Bovary, or if I'm looking at a picture, or if I'm going to a theater and I see a play of Shakespeare and I see Macbeth on the stage, that's also different forms of the imaginary. So the way in which Sartre is going to sort of propose this is that dreams as forms of the imaginary are pre-reflexive and not reflexive. So let me just explain that. So the idea is that what distinguishes the experience of the imaginary when I'm now imagining Madame Bovary as opposed to when I'm dreaming is that the condition of dreaming is that there is no reflexive awareness that I am dreaming. Because if I were aware while I was dreaming that I am dreaming, then I would no longer be dreaming. On the other hand, there is a consciousness of oneself dreaming without a knowledge or knowing that I am dreaming. And here in French, Sartre captures this in the difference between what he calls conscience de soi et connaissance de soi. So a conscience de soi, in English you would say consciousness of, but you put the brackets, that you put the of in brackets because there's no relation. There's no relation of consciousness to itself as an object. That is a conscience de soi, or technically a pre-reflexive consciousness, is not the same thing as a connaissance de soi, or translated in English, acquaintance or knowledge of the self. So pre-reflexive consciousness, if you wish, operates in dreaming. A good example of this is in a nightmare. If you know who Freddy Krueger is, if I'm dreaming tonight, for whatever reason, that Freddy Krueger is running after me with an axe in my dream, then I have a sense of fright, and I experience that. But of course, if I become awakened, or if I ask myself, am I dreaming this, then I'm awoken. So the first characteristic is that the imaginary of dreaming is a purely pre-reflexive consciousness that structurally prevents any reflection, or rather, as Sartre rather dramatically says it, reflection would annihilate the dream. So it would terminate the dream, and like in a nightmare. I awake and I say, oh, I was dreaming. Or I look around and make sure that Freddy Krueger is actually not in my hotel room, running after me. So that's the first feature. It's purely pre-reflexive and therefore episodic. It's episodic in that sense, in this sort of sense. The second, and this is quite interesting, is that dreaming is an imaginary consciousness. Or an imagining consciousness, which in Sartre's thinking is characterized by what he calls pure belief. And here, one has to understand, he has a very technical way to understand what he means by belief, which at least in English, I'll be curious how it is in Spanish, doesn't translate well. So Sartre has this interesting argument, both in the imaginary, but if also you're familiar with being in nothingness, that when I perceive a table, and I see that the table is there, then something about the world is revealed to me which I have not constituted or made. So the character of perception is to be revelatory or disclosive. That doesn't involve any belief. So when I see that there's a table, it's not that I believe that there's a table, I see that there is a table. And that is because, at least in French, the word croire in croyance always conveys an attitude of opining or having to believe something. So this is very different than in English, because in English you would say, I take something to be true, or I have justified, warranted belief that there's a table. But in French that doesn't work, because if I say, je crois qu'il y a une table, it means that I'm not sure that there is a table. So I could never say that, so if I walk into the room right now and I saw Ignacio and I see Ignacio, in that act of seeing Ignacio, there's no belief that I see Ignacio. There just is that I see Ignacio. Now it could be that all of a sudden Ignacio transforms into Freddy Krueger or a monster, but then something about the perception has motivated a belief. So again, it's also very viscerally, there has to be a motivation for a doxic modalization of perception. I'll translate it into Husserlian terms. So whereas perception discloses something about the world and doesn't involve belief, belief has to be motivated by perception. If I walk into the room and I'm like, is that a, are those cookies? I don't have my glasses to see far. Are those cookies over there? And then I'm motivated to ask myself, is that cookie? And I change my perception. Sartre argues that dreaming is the complete opposite of perception. It discloses nothing about the world. And therefore, it is what he calls a form of pure belief. He calls it croyance pure. But interestingly, a pure belief, and this is where it gets complicated, not the belief in the dream as a reality, but a pure belief that is unlike other kinds of beliefs because it's not a motivated belief. I.e., I cannot but believe from the start in the givenness of the dreaming consciousness. So it's an interesting, he calls it a non-persuasive belief. It's kind of a brilliant idea. It's a belief that hasn't persuaded me because I'm already caught in believing. And I'll come back to this idea of the dream as a non-persuasive belief, because as some of you may be familiar, in the analysis of bad faith, in being a nothingness, he would say bad faith is like falling asleep and a non-persuasive belief. I enter into bad faith like falling asleep, and it's a non-persuasive belief. So it's a non-persuasive belief. You might say nothing in the dream speaks for or against what I experience. Another way to put it is that the dream for Sartre is a fundamentally claustrophobic consciousness. It is fully self-enclosed in itself, that it has no distance, and that's why it's a pure belief that is non-persuasive, if you wish. So this is the second feature. The dream is pre-reflexive. It's not a perception. It discloses nothing. It's a pure belief. In Sartre's, again, in Sartre's almost technical definition of belief. Another way to put this, and this is not Sartre, is that dream experiences are what I would call modally exhaustive. They're modally exhaustive because they cannot undergo modalization within the belief, in the sense of they foreclose a space for distraction, mind wandering. You sort of don't get bored in your belief and start thinking of something. You don't get bored in your dream and start thinking of something else. In the way that, let's say right now, I don't know, you're sort of bored with what's going on, you might just be thinking of something else. So in the dream, there's a sense in which you are fully captured by the imaginary. And the only way to escape the capture of the imaginary, which is the capture of your own consciousness, is to no longer dream and to awake and to annihilate it. So there's no kind of degrees of navigation, or technically there's no modalization. They are modally exhaustive. And that tells us also that what it means to be awake to the world when I'm awake is precisely to be open to the possibility of concurrent and different kinds of modalizable experiences. So the third aspect, and I'm just running through the aspects of dreaming to get to then the key idea of stories. I mean, this is how Sartre argues. He leads us to the idea that dreams are stories by first introducing these sort of phenomenological characteristics of what distinguishes the structure of intentionality, the structure of consciousness of the dreaming as the imaginary. Sartre argues that so now it's going to get technical, between the pre-reflexive experience of me dreaming and the experience of awakening and knowing that I have dreamt, I wake up and I have a dream, there's always a kind of fissure or a gap. Not only a temporal gap, I don't know exactly when last night I dreamt the dream that I dreamt, but also that there's no clear identification between the reflective awareness that I was dreaming and the me who was dreaming. So there's a sense in which there's this fissure between me dreaming and I was dreaming always marks the kind of question, who is the who is dreaming when I was not aware of myself dreaming? Right? Who is this who is dreaming? And also, who is the who is, as Sartre will argue, telling the story to the who is dreaming? So it's going to introduce a really complex question of who is the who of the dream and of the storyteller, given that the storyteller is none other than the consciousness who is not aware of itself as dreaming. So you might say that there is always, in any recollection of a dream, there's always the preservation of an irreducible distance of a peculiar sort, a distance between me and myself, or I and myself, or I and me, but also the distance between each of the characters and identities that we lend them when we remember who we dreamt of. A distance almost without distance, and a distance that's quite fascinating and illuminating, which is something like the proximity and contact with something which seems very far away. And that's the peculiar kind of sense we have of something is very proximate and intimate to us, the dream. We know it's I dreamt it, but on the other hand, there's always this sort of distance that the dream is in a somewhere and a sometime, which is both proximate and yet remote at the same time. And that's going to be, again, another feature for Sartre of what's peculiar or characteristic. I'll put it in, again, Husserlian terms, since I know many of you. Husserl also argues, now, Husserl almost wrote nothing about dreams. In some of his manuscripts here or there, and in some letters with Jean Hering and others, Eugen Fink has a whole discussion of dreams in Vergegenwärtigung und Bild. So there's not much, but in Husserl's conception of fantasy or the imaginary, Husserl argues that the structure of the imaginary consciousness is a double consciousness, eine doppelte Bewusstsein, or he calls it a Spaltungsbewusstsein in German. And again, the idea here is that when I imagine a unicorn or Madame Bovary, not only is there the imaginary object which I can describe to you, or let's imagine I'm an artist and I want to paint something and I imagine what I want to paint, I can describe to you what I envision, but there also has to be a noetic act of seeing, which is not an actual perception, but is the as-if of seeing. Or in Sartre's term, there is the irrealization of seeing. It's as if I see the as-if of Madame Bovary, because I don't actually see Madame Bovary. And so that produces a split consciousness, because when I'm imagining Madame Bovary, I seem to see Madame Bovary, but I know that I am not seeing Madame Bovary, so there is both a consciousness of not seeing Madame Bovary and a consciousness of seeming to see Madame Bovary. And that's what Husserl calls a Spaltungsbewusstsein, or split consciousness. He also speaks of it as a quasi-ego. So Sartre will pick up this idea, but Sartre will say that in dreaming, there is no unity between the consciousness that knows itself not to see Madame Bovary and the imagined consciousness of seeing Madame Bovary. Whereas in Husserl, there is always a unity of the Spaltungsbewusstsein, which is anchored in the living present of wakefulness. So this is the sense in which then, as then Sartre says, we have the person of the dream, the individual that we dream, is always somewhere at some time. And this somewhere at some time, and these figures aren't necessarily identifiable as in my time and me. And this is then the way in which Sartre thinks that we can both project ourselves and identify ourselves with, let's call it the characters that we dream, but also not. Right? There's no identification there. So I do not necessarily feel myself to be him, the protagonist in the dream. In a sense, I have a sense of being outside, On the other hand, this outside is also the inside because it's me who dreamt it. So it's an experience of consciousness being both inside and outside of itself in that sense. So now it's at this point that after Sartre goes through all of these, that Sartre wants to say, now I want to specify more clearly what is this pure belief of consciousness, which is the imaginary. And it's at this point that he introduces the idea, in order to render a bit more specific or clear what he means by the dream as pure belief, that he introduces the hypothesis that dreams are experienced as, I'm going to quote, a story that I am reading or being told. So that's his claim, that a dream is a story that either I am reading or I am being told. And this is the final stage in the argument to fully disconnect the imaginary of dreaming from other forms of the imaginary, which in Sartre's thinking relied in their constitution on what Sartre called the analogon. So the analogon, in the way in which Sartre understood other forms of the imaginary, is that the imaginary always required something what he called the analogon. An example would be if a child is playing at being a knight, has a sword and what have you, then the plastic sword and the helmet are the props that the child uses to realize themselves into being a knight. And this is also really important that Sartre describes the imaginary as a structure of play. So, if you have kids and they're playing being a knight and they have a sword, and you're like, that's not a real sword, they'll be like, okay, stupid, get out of my game, right? Because in the playing of the game, the sword is something that you perceive that is physical, but it has magical properties. Mm-hmm. Or if any of you are playing Fortnite or you're playing games on computers, the icon that you see of your sword is an analogon for the imaginary object, and if you project your avatar, or if you're playing, Call of Duty or whatever, whatever game you're playing, all of these are icons or objects that are analogons. So Sartre thinks that, or if you're at a theater and you see someone, the actor becomes the analogon for Macbeth. Because on the one hand, you see a physical actor, but when you're in the theater and captured in the imaginary of the theater, you don't see the actor, you see Macbeth. So he's going to argue that dreams lack any analogon. There's no analogon in dreams, and that's then why he's going to say, I need another way to explain or to describe a dream, because it's an imaginary that has no analogon, precisely because it's not in any way connected to perception. Mm-hmm. In the way that even if I'm reading a book, the analogon for Madame Bovary are the words on the page. That's the analogon. So the imaginary... So he's going to say that dreams have no analogon. Why? Because they're experienced as stories. And that's why he says, quote, the sole fact that the dream is given as a story, he uses the French word histoire, should permit us to understand the kind of belief that we can attribute to it. And so that's going to be basically the idea that it's structured as a story. A story either that we read or that is told to us, but of course not told to us by someone or a consciousness other than ourselves, though we are not aware of ourselves as the one who is telling us the story. And also if you take the other way, if I'm reading the story, I'm not conscious of being the one who authored the story. I'm in the position of the reader. So let's try to make sense of that. Like, what does that actually mean? So it's interesting that earlier in the imaginary, Sartre speaks about reading. So even before he talks about dreaming and dreaming as a form of reading, he speaks about reading. And in a previous discussion, Sartre says that reading always involves the imaginary, insofar that the act of reading involves, for Sartre, the spontaneous production of meaning of words on the basis of perceiving letters on a page or hearing the sounds of someone. And that requires what he calls the imaginary. The meanings of the word in his language are transcendent objects, such that reading engages the imaginary in transcending the signs that I see on the page or the words that I hear towards the apprehension of meaning. And so that's the sense in which then, in terms of reading fiction, words function as instructions to our imagination to produce for ourselves the imaginary object. So it's a performative theory of fiction that Sartre has. It's not that when I see the word Madame Bovary has green eyes in the light, these are not interpreted as signs that refer to an object. They are instructions for my imagination to produce the object. So he has a non-referential theory of fictional objects. So it's very different than all this debate about, do fictional objects exist, et cetera, et cetera. And that I have to adopt the attitude of the reader. So it also requires a different kind of attitude, which is the attitude of the imaginary. And here I'll just mention as a kind of, just an aside, it's really interesting that I think from a Sartrean point of view, I'm sure you have this problem in Mexico, what ChatGPT is destroying is the imaginary of reading. Right? Because if now I can go to ChatGPT and I'd be like, what is Sartre's imaginary about? And it says, Sartre's imaginary is actually, then I have not used the imaginary to produce the object or the novel. So it's kind of, the destruction of the imaginary through AI. I think that would be how Sartre would look at something like AI, because there has to be the exercise of the spontaneous productivity of the object of understanding in fiction. Which is then open to interpretation, because when you read Madame Bovary, you might imagine or understand it differently than I do. So this is kind of a Sartrean critique of AI, because the reading is about the cultivation of the imaginary, and what he calls, in French, he calls it the savoir imaginant, a knowing of the imaginary, and in that sense. So, in that sense, there's another discussion of reading. I'm going to try to understand what he means by reading in dreams by looking at other places in Sartre where he speaks about reading. One is when he's just giving his account of reading as such. I'm reading a book. The other is, very famously, if you remember, in Sartre's autobiography, Les Mots, in the words, where Sartre recounts that as a young child, he was jealous of his mother's ability to read and to read to him. And so he decided one day to read on his own, even though he couldn't read. So Sartre in Les Mots talks about how he was fascinated with the books. They were these mysterious things. And then he takes a book, Jules Verne, Tribulations of a Chinaman in China, and then he says, this is Sartre from Les Mots, there, perched on a cot, so a bed, I pretend to read. My eyes followed black signs without skipping a single one, and I told myself a story out loud, even though he actually couldn't read. So it's interesting here that, as he says here, books for him inculcated in him a kind of idealism. Because even though he didn't know how to read, it sort of motivated him to transcend the world of the given and to purely fabulate. And that's going to be the... So that's the sense in which this is another sense of reading. So clearly, these two conceptions of reading are not the same as reading in a dream, because I'm not actually looking at a book. And it's not actually a condition of I actually don't know how to read, and therefore I'm fabulating reading. So what could it mean that dreams are stories, histoire, which are neither symbols nor signs? So here I'm going to propose a way to sort of make sense of it. On a classical conception of what a narrative is, and this is if you look at Paul Ricoeur's Time and Narrative, if you look at, it goes back to Aristotle, is that narrative is the configuration of a temporal order to action where there is always the question, what comes next? Mm-hmm. There's always motivated what comes next. So if we take that as at least a minimal definition of the structure of a narrative, that would mean that there can be a modalization that occurs insofar I can ask what comes next. But by Sartre's own account of the dream as modally exhaustive, there can never arise the question what comes next in the dream. Mm-hmm. So it would seem that dreams cannot be narratives, even though Sartre says they're stories. But I'm going to try to solve this problem with an argument. And that's by introducing a distinction made by the French literary theorist Gérard Genet between, in French, récit et histoire. Mm-hmm. So in French literary theory, the distinction is first introduced by a very important French literary theorist called Gérard Genet, very famous in France. Blanchot also uses this distinction, if you're familiar with l'espace de la littérature. The difference between un récit et an histoire. So again, we have a line, and I'm curious in Spanish how you translate. In English, history doesn't mean, history only means like history of Mexico. But in French, histoire means a story. Same thing. Mm-hmm. So, histoire is, je te raconte une histoire. I'm going to tell you a story about what happened to me in last night in Jalapa or whatever. So, histoire is narrative structure. Récit is, in English, it's something like a telling or a recounting, is how I would translate the French récit. So, what distinguishes a récit, a telling or a recounting, from a narrative is that a récit doesn't strictly have a narrative form in which there is the motivation to ask the question, what comes next? It doesn't have a plot. Right? It doesn't have that sense of there being a plot. Instead, a récit, and here I'm just using the distinction by Gérard Genet, also Blanchot uses this distinction, if you're familiar with Blanchot, is that it's not organized. So it's a story that's not organized around a storyline or a narrative emplotment, is a récit. And here, a récit is also a telling that calls attention to the action of telling itself. So a story calls attention to what the story is about, whereas a récit calls attention to the telling of the story itself and captivates the hearer in the telling, in the art of the telling. And so I'd like to propose that Sartre's conception of dreams as stories should be more properly understood not as narratives, but as récits, as pre-reflexive, pre-consciousness, a kind of a dream that calls attention to the act of telling, that has a structure of time. This happens, then this happens, then this happens, but there's no transparent sense that there is a plot. And that's why many of the dreams that you remember, you can tell what happened, but you don't know what happened. In the way that if I tell you a story of, last night we were having a great conversation about neo-Kantianism and Hermann Cohen. If I tell you that story of this, you know what happened last night. Mm-hmm. So a récit is not simply a sequence of events. It's not a full-blown narrative where I can tell you what happened. It's a configuration of events that are not simply sequential. It's not simply, one damn thing after another, but also it doesn't have the sense that I know what happened. And that's why many of the dreams, you're like, oh, I can tell you this, this, and this. I mean, I'm not even clear that's the correct sequence. there's some temporal connection, but if I'm like, what was that about? You're like, I don't know, I don't want to see Freud. Right? I'm like, I need to go somewhere else to figure out what that's about. So this is the sense in which I think that it's a récit in that sense. The dream is a story thing. And it's a story thing that then compels us to tell a narrative about that story. So that's the way in which dreams compel us or are worthy of narratives, because I now want to tell a narrative to interpret what the récit was about, given that the récit was itself not a narrative. So that's the sense in which I'd like to propose that a dream is a récit without a transparent plot, but it can be in want of a narrative configuration that would render transparent its meaning for the life of consciousness to whom the dream as a récit has not simply been told but has occurred. So when Sartre says it's a story that I read or it's a story that I'm told, I would say, no, it's more strongly, it's a récit that occurs to me. But it's a récit that occurs to me without it being a narrative where I know or have a sense of what it is about. And that's why then there is the desire to recount and tell others, as well as of ourselves, about the dreams that occurred to us. In English, I call them story dreams of nocturnal wanderings, in that sense. And therefore the desire, the narrative desire, to assimilate the contingency of the dream. Because, of course, it's very contingent. So hence, the sense in which dreams are experienced as incoherent, fragmented, in want of a plot and narration, and yet somehow a kind of solicitation for narration, as with Gilgamesh, who then goes to his mother to say, tell me the narrative, what is the narrative that tells me what this récit was about, given that the récit was not about anything. And that's also why there can be multiple interpretations of the récit. So this is the sense in which then there is also then going to always be a fissure between the I of the dream and the person to whom the dream is occurring, because there can be multiple narratives or multiple interpretations of what the récit could mean as a narrative kind of reconstruction. And that's then the sense in which the dream is, in the sense of récit, but not a narrative. So now let me just say two more things, and I'll just bring it to a close. So I've tried to sort of argue two things. One is to take seriously and make sense of Sartre's hypothesis, dreams are intrinsically narratives, while also recognizing that they cannot be understood as narratives in the traditional form in which narratives are understood. They have to be understood as récit, not narrative. And also, therefore, try to give an argument for why dreams are the things of which we want narratives. We want and narrative is the structure for the interpretation. This is also, if you're familiar, Paul Ricoeur has a kind of hermeneutical attempt to rethink Freud's theory of dream interpretation, Traumdeutung, and he also, Ricoeur says, narrative is the form in which dreams then attain meaning. And it's also very Freudian. If you're familiar with Freud's Traumdeutung, every example of a dream that he gives, Irma's injection, which is the famous one, is always a story that he tells, a narrative that he tells, or the dreams of the wolf man or the rat man, etc. So the narrative structure of dreams, I think you can make sense of, even though the dream is itself not a narrative. The second thing I've tried to argue is that dreams as a récit, which is not a narrative, is episodic. It's not narrative in the formal sense, but it is a story. And so Sartre's insight into dreams tells us something phenomenologically about dreams, which neither Galen Strawson, Husserl, and Dan Zahavi on one side, nor Arendt, the big guns, we would say, Paul Ricoeur on this side can make sense of. So that would force us to rethink this distinction between episodic and narrative. And I mean, here I don't have the time to do that, but I think we have to rethink fundamentally the terms of this debate by looking at a very particular kind of experience on phenomenological grounds. So that's sort of the argument I want to make. So now let me sort of step away from the positive accomplishment of the argument. I've been successful, and now raise sort of three problems with the account, with Sartre's account. The first one is this idea that dreams fundamentally do not disclose anything about reality. This is very important for Sartre, that we don't learn anything about reality. And indeed, we don't really learn anything about ourselves through dreams. This is in La Nausée, in Nausea, there's this very nice passage where Roquintin says, to live or to tell. Mm-hmm. And this idea that we constantly sort of immerse and give meaning to our lives by telling stories, by narrating stories, which actually prohibits us from actually confronting the sense of what it is to live. So stories are a form of self-deception. They're a kind of narratives in which we enclose ourselves precisely because we cannot live. So it's an interesting idea that the paradigmatic form of a self-enclosed consciousness is, there's always the person I want to be is trying to fulfill the story I want to be told about who I am. I'm a famous professor, I'm really smart, I travel all over the world. We're all constructing stories about ourselves, and then we want to be these stories, but we have therefore fictionalized ourselves. And so we constantly have to break out of these stories by becoming awoken to the fact that we are living just dreams. So in that sense, dreams can never reveal anything about the self. They're always strategies of self-concealment or bad faith, etc. But here I'd like to propose two examples that would argue against that. Not so much to completely reject Sartre's conception, but to show that there's something much more complicated about the sense in which dreams are aussi. And I'm going to use two literary examples, and then I'll finish. One is Arthur Schnitzler's novel, Traumnovelle, from which Kubrick made the film Eyes Wide Shut. So the last Kubrick film with Nicole Kidman and Tom Cruise is based on a Schnitzler novella, Traumnovelle. And in Traumnovelle, Schnitzler's Traumnovelle, if you're familiar with the novel, which is really brilliant, the film is also great, dreams become entangled with the narratives that each of the two main characters, if you remember, that we articulate to ourselves and each other during our wakeful hours. Traumnovelle, if you remember, begins with an opening portrait of an apparently normal bourgeois family, framed through a clear distinction between fictional emergent and a story. Remember, both in the novel and in the film, they're reading a story to their child, a young girl. So it begins with this idea that there's fictional stories, fictional narratives, and then extended conversation about which is not fictional. The conversation between the characters are Fridolin and Albertina are the two characters. Returning to their conversation, then each narrative of their respective experiences, remember at the masquerade ball attended the night before, they start to probe each other's sort of apparent sexual attraction and missed opportunities to meeting these two other people, if you remember. And there's a sense in which then these narratives then go into the narratives of the summer holiday in Denmark. And so the point here is that the narratives that they exchange to each other allow them to recount the real of their own desire, their own sexual desire for others, which had constantly been repressed not by storytelling but by living. And so here the function of stories that they're telling to each other is precisely a way in which it allows the real of their desire, which had always been suppressed by their living, to, in a sense, manifest itself. And this then produces what, at the end of the novel, Schnitzler calls die traumhafte Realität, which is very difficult, the dream-affected reality where, and here I'm going to have to be a little rude or indiscreet, but remember at the end of the novel, at the end of the film, the last scene where they're in the store, they finally come to recognize the real of their desires. And then they're in the store, it's about Christmas time, the girl, their kid, is looking for a child, and then the Nicole Kidman turns to Tom Cruise. It's going to be and she says, "Let's go home and fuck." Right? Like that's we've now been able to confront the real. We can finally be fully desirous for each other after going through this traumhafte Realität. So that would be the way in which here the whole experience of the story is a kind of dream that is wakeful, lived, but allows for the real of desire. The last example, and just to bear me your patience, this is in Han Kang. Han Kang is the South Korean novelist who won the Nobel Prize. In her brilliant novel, The Vegetarian, which is absolutely stunning. I mean, also other novels. In Han Kang's novel, The Vegetarian, the husband of the main character, this woman called Young Hyu, finds his wife at 4 a.m. standing silently in the glow of an open refrigerator, apparently fascinated and absorbed by what it is that she sees. When pressed by her annoyed husband, she only replies, "I had a dream." This dream of hers, or sequence of dreams, it's actually a récit, is recounted in her own voice, and it is the thing that dramatically propels the narrative of the story. Her husband returns home later that evening to find his wife discarding any meat in the refrigerator, throwing it all away. And she's haunted by the mute imperative of this dream that she had, that she never explains, never narrates. She simply says, "I had a dream, I had a dream," and this produces this transformation of her life where she decides, just like that, to no longer eat meat. And this provokes then the violence of her husband, the violence of her family, to make her the good wife who eats meat, who is dutiful, etc., etc. And she keeps saying, "I had a dream, I had a dream." And the arc of transfiguration of the novel is that ultimately, I won't spoil it completely for you, not only does she wants to not eat meat, she doesn't want to be a vegetarian, she wants to become a plant. She wants to, in a sense, overcome the human and become a plant. And she's eventually sent to an insane asylum, where her sister then comes at the end. And this is the end where she's trying, her sister's like, why all this happened? And Young Hyu, she says, "What I'm trying to say is I had this dream. And this dream," as she says, "is the only dream that I have that would allow myself to dissolve and to wake up at some point where I would fully be real other than fundamentally anything that I have lived." And then the narrative ends. And then one sees, the last scene in the novel is you see blazing green fire like rippling flanks of massive animal wild savage life. She has become pure life and pure living, impelled by a dream. So these would be two narratives precisely of dreams that impel the real. Here, we're talking about almost like in a Spinozistic, the real of I become pure nature. That is the real. And in Schnitzler, a more almost psychoanalytic, the real of desire, which is the real around which my life is fundamentally anchored. And with that, I'll thank you for your patience.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. And I think we have enough time to talk and to discuss the ideas and the ways how to solve this problem and these two ways to understand dreams. Yeah, I have my own questions, but I have to first leave the others speak. So who wants to say something first?
Me, would you go first?
Yeah, Arturo.
Sure. No, just start. I'm very ashamed for being late. I'm sorry.
No,
I thought it
worries.
was at 5. I was just here around the corner making some time. But I missed the right time. No, just.
Yeah, I want to ask one thing. I think this guy poses the same problem, not about dreams, but about the way he understands life in his theory of biography. Because he says quite explicitly that life is discontinuous in the sense that you forget all the time who you are or the things you have done, and only when you make this reflexive exercise you reconstitute the continuity. But you only do that taking on account the events that are significant for you. So that means that you always don't you don't you don't speak about facts. You only speak about what is important to you. For example, if in this moment it will be a earthquake and you don't have any experience to earthquakes, there are people will say after, I don't know, 1 week, well, yeah, it was a earthquake, it was not that bad, but maybe you don't have experience in the earthquakes. You would say, wow, it was horrible, my experience was awful, so on. So I want to ask you if you are aware of, or you know this theory of biography and it is related to these problems of discontinuity and narrative and the construction of self, or it's not related.
It's related because Wilhelm Scott refers to Dilthey.
Okay.
So precisely the idea that life as a unity is a Zusammenhang, the term of Dilthey, which introduces continuity between discontinuous parts.
Okay.
And so Scott understands it this way. I mean, in Scott's sort of thinking, which is inspired from Dilthey, it's a Geschichte, and that's the sense in which there's contingencies that occur, things that are unexpected. You do this, you do that, and then you try to integrate them into some kind of continuous whole, and that is then the Zusammenhang and the unity of life.
Yeah, but this unity, in the sense, in the case of Dilthey, I think I'm right, is always reconstructive.
Exactly, yes, it's reconstructive as well. I mean, for Scott as well, it's reconstructive. Now, for Scott, it's reconstructive at the biographical level, but at the historical level, we are entangled in histories. Mexican history, I mean, all the statues of Mexican revolutionaries, Juarez, etc. So our collective existence is also, for Scott, entangled in histories. And those are also, to some degree, reconstructive. So the construction of histories is, in that sense, reconstructive. It presupposes first a pure sequence of temporal events. There has to be befores and afters that are constituted. And then the reconfiguration of sequence into meaningful wholes. And that then introduces continuity, and for Scott also unity, into the discontinuity of events. And then you're absolutely right that it also involves, at least in this context, a kind of criteria of selection. What events are the important or salient events that become integrated into the story or the narrative? Such that the extreme would be, so Andy Warhol wrote a book where Andy Warhol basically wrote down, or he recorded, everything that he said in the period of 1 day. Okay. That's not really a narrative, because the book starts by him waking up, having a phone call with this person called Candy Darling, who was a kind of flashy transvestite, and then they have a very long and boring conversation about going and buying shoes. And then, so imagine if everything that you said and did from the moment you woke up this morning to tonight, you wrote down and you just printed. That wouldn't, I mean, it's kind of meaninglessness. So you're absolutely right that biography, this conception of biography, because I would say that at least in literary theories of biography, it's quite complicated what constitutes a biography and whether this is the form of a biography, introducing continuity into discontinuity, right, by picking out the salient events of a life. But I would say in a very traditional conception, for example, of biography, which this is, it involves some kind of selection process, because not everything that you experience is worthy of being integrated into a story, right? And so yes, that would be another example of a narrative conception of what it is to have a life, is to construct a life by being able to narrate it or construct it as a narrative. And you're absolutely right that Dilthey is, not only Dilthey, but Dilthey is, Life of Schleiermacher, Jan Hegel, the interest also in biography himself. But this, I think, in the German tradition goes back to Goethe, right? This is sort of the idea of a Bildungsroman, Meister's Lehrjahre, is precisely that. It's that the formation of the self. And here we're talking about Hegel, since I know there's some closet Hegelians here. This is Jean Hippolyte's thesis about the phenomenology of spirit. That phenomenology of spirit is constructed as a Bildungsroman. Because it's a kind of narrative structure. Spirit only constitutes itself as spirit by the capacity to narrate its own story. And that story is precisely the phenomenology of spirit. So I think in the German tradition, there's a long German tradition that has this basic idea in some form or another, and Dilthey is an important representative of that tradition. William Scott clearly draws on that, and explicitly Dilthey in Geschichte verstrichen.
Okay, thank you.
Do you want to go first?
Sure.
Well, just follow up on the last point you raised, your sort of problematical remarks on Sartre's account. Because before you introduced those remarks, I was thinking that, maybe what Sartre is missing is an account of desire, because for him, like, the will is more basic, and I was thinking, like, following, like, laws, and, like, what dreams tell us about ourselves is usually our own desires. And that's what you illustrated very clearly in the first example. But I think the second example was different. The novel from,
a different example.
So just to clarify, what is revealed in this second example?
So maybe I'll just take an opportunity to say something I didn't make explicit, partly because of time, but Sartre, both in L'Imaginaire and in discussion of dreams and elsewhere, has a rejection of the Freudian conception of dreams.
Okay.
Where dreams are produced by an unconscious, and the repression of a certain libido, a certain desire, which both has to be satisfied but postponed. So it's a kind of imaginary wish fulfillment. So a theory of dreams that really depends on a theory of desire, and therefore a conception of the unconscious. Sartre rejects that. Because he rejects the idea of an unconscious in the Freudian sense. Pre-reflexive consciousness is not unconscious.
Yeah.
But to your point, at least to what's implied in your point, it is quite striking that in the discussion of dreams in the Imaginaire, there's no discussion of desire. So that he doesn't have this idea that dreams are themselves the way in which desire works itself through a consciousness, demands fulfillment, without it being actually fulfilled.
Okay.
Right. So that's something quite interesting, like what happens to desire in Sartre's conception of the imaginary, even though in Being a Nothingness, there is a conception of desire, because there is the desire, in French, the lack of being, le manque de l'être, nothingness, is the desire to be.
Okay.
It's actually the desire to be.
Okay.
Le manque de l'être, c'est le désir à être, Sartre says. It's not the desire to be, it's the desire to be.
Okay.
And that's why then the end of Being a Nothingness proposes the idea that there has to be existential psychoanalysis. Right. So it's interesting that at least in L'Imaginaire, there's no conception of desire that Sartre deploys or integrates into his conception of consciousness. In Being a Nothingness, it's strictly speaking not consciousness, it's bonsoir, bonsoir, etc. But in his conception of the self, let's call it desire is actually central. I mean, the example of the woman on the date is all about desire, right? The example of going into the, I mean, all the examples, and then when we come to the great discussion of sex, you know, the only great discussion of sex in 20th century philosophy and sadism and masochism, that's all about desire. So it would be interesting as a kind of thought experiment, what do you do with the conception of desire, which is central to what it is to be a self in being a nothingness, as well as later in his Flaubert biography, for example, there's a whole theory of desire as well that's important. And how do you read that back into his account of dreams that he puts there?
It's odd that he considers them always bad faith.
Yeah, well, dreams are forms of bad faith. Or it's not that dreams are bad faith, but bad faith is analogous to dreams. Because he says quite explicitly, I fall into bad faith like falling asleep. And it is a form of self-deception. Now, dreams is strictly speaking not a form of self-deception. Now, with regard to the Han Kang, I mean, I read the Han Kang story as she has this dream which she describes, but she never narrates. And it's a récit. And it occurs to her, it's a kind of event. And it's a kind of force of the real that then propels this continuous transformation and dissolving of her life. Wanting to be, almost in Deleuzian sense, becoming plant. So here, and this is not what she desires, because it's not, she desires to be the plant. It's the force that transforms her to be the plant, or to be fully organic, if you wish, to dissolve as a human, and dissolve any attachment to flesh, beginning with eating meat and her own body. And so here, it's a dream as a récit that occurs. There's never an attempt to interpret it, in the book at least. The book itself, the novel itself, is strictly speaking not an interpretation of the dream, it is the effect of that dream. Right, it is the effect of that dream. And then, if you're familiar with the novel, I mean, I had to skip because I'd be here for another hour. I mean, it's a complex novel because, you know, she then, there's a sexual encounter with the husband of the sister who's an artist who wants her to pose naked. So it also, I think that whole, it's the second part of the novel, that sort of philosophically to do, you know, tremendous violence to a novel. That's the way in which this is fundamentally not about desire. Right, because she passes through desire, right? In that, you know, where the husband wants the pain and things like that. So that's a very different, where the dream here is of a sea. It is the force of the real, insofar it disrupts the order of the symbolic and the imaginary. And of course, in Han Kang, what's really important here is the, you know, the critique of patriarchy. And, you know, and I mean, there's a feminist critique that's very important here. There's a critique against meat eating, and of course, of South Korean rigid society of roles. I mean, there's that whole political context, which is very subdued in the novel, but it's clearly, that's also what that novel is doing. So that's a very different conception of a dream as récit, as a force. And the Traumnovelle is the dream as the revelation of the real of desire, that living has always been masquerading. And I think that's what Kubrick, this is not in the Traumnovelle novel, but the Kubrick is, that's the key, I mean, that's the brilliance of Kubrick, is to have really seen that, and just to introduce that last scene, Let's Go Fuck, which is an amazing scene, because bang, that's the real, right? Now we really see each other for who we are, without the bourgeois of the woman and the man, and the, you know, it's Christmas time and all that stuff. And it's kind of a carnal kind of honesty or truth that has been revealed for them to now have their marriage back, right? And that's a different conception. And both of those, I think, you cannot make sense of from a Sartrean conception. That's why I gave those as two examples.
So in the second example, nothing is revealed. It's just the force.
Nothing is revealed. It is it's about she is completely transformed. the end is ambiguous because remember the sister goes visit her,
Yeah.
and then I remember correctly, the sister then it's this inconclusive dialogue about I had a dream, it's just a dream,
Yeah.
and then the sister sort of leaves.
And goes to the forest.
Yeah, and then an ambulance comes, so it's just kind of like leaving you hanging there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Arturo.
Yes.
How was a first and then...
Thank you. This is very good. I like it. I like it very much.
Thank you.
It was very appealing. I like the difference between the récit and histoire. And then after Ignacio's commentary, I was thinking about shelling, right? Because all three versions of The Ages of the World start in the same way, which is something like, I wrote it here, something like, das Vergangene wird gewusst, like the past year known, so to speak, das Gegenwärtige wird erkannt, present is, let's say, recognized, and das Zukünftige wird geahndet, like foretold. And then he follows saying, das Gewusste, that means the past, wird erzählt, narrated, then the present, das Erkannte, wird dargestellt, which is probably what Hegel intended, the Darstellung of the system, or system of Darstellung, and the future, das Geahnete wird geweissagt. This is something like foretold. So I find this very interesting because, in a way, Schelling is saying that there is no progression of appropriation of the past, but that there is like an autonomy of the past as such. Then there's the present, and then there's the future. That means that something like dreams or something of the order of the unconscious remains in the past, which cannot be addressed philosophically, so to speak, but only through mythology, right? And but this is the interesting thing because he's saying that the past needs to be narrated. It cannot be presented, dargestellt. It has to be narrated. But at the same time, the very content is not narration. There is this something called like nature, and it's actually in Schellingian terms this very obscure thing of the history of thought. But at the very end is the experience of some consciousness in the beginning of humanity that doesn't know how to cope with nature and phenomena around. So that's not a dream, but there is something dream-like that has to be narrated. But at the same time, there are like two ways to access the past. One is as Geschichte, and the other is as narration. So there is no privileged access to the past because we have to deal at the same time with Geschichte, which belongs to the mode of Darstellung, and with narration, which is the very obscure mode of dealing with the past, which we feel unease. At least that's again myself with Schelling speaking about religion, mythology, and the very first beginning. So my commentary would be: what do you think about this, so to speak, distribution of consciousness in regards to phenomenology, which Schelling says that there is no single last basis of consciousness, but it's distributed in a system of anticipating the topic of psychoanalysis, but instead of speaking about the unconscious and pre-conscious, unconscious, and consciousness, he's speaking about a distribution of experience, and we are simultaneously experiencing the past, the present, and the future, and that means, philosophically speaking at least, that we cannot subsume religion, philosophy, for example, but at the same time, mythology, philosophy, and religion are playing at the same time. So I don't know. This came to my mind when you were speaking between récit and histoire, because there are two ways of elaborating récit. One is like an mythological narration, and the other is the rational narration, so to speak, in sense of Hegel. So when you think about this the past is some material, in this Schellingian sense, that cannot be exhausted in a single, let's call it, conscious procedure or mode of apprehension. So that's where this is what makes desire possible, or deception, or Sehnsucht, because there are always different times. That's what I want to say. Schelling comes to, or asserts that consciousness is living at different temporalities at the same time, and it's not only a problem of what's the meaning of a dream, but what's the temporality of dreams and of consciousness, and of course of desire. But thank you very much. It was very
Thank you, Arturo. So there's a lot there, and it's fascinating. Especially, I'm very much into Schelling.
Oh,
because I'm very much into Rosenzweig.
right.
And the Theoria Lösung is the attempt to rewrite the ages of the world, as you know.
Redemption
So let me say a few things. And maybe I'll just start with something a bit more minor, and then I'll get to, I think, the interesting question about different temporalities, and also this inexhaustibility of the past material. That seems to be two really interesting ideas that I think have a lot of interesting resonances and ways to think those ideas in, since you refer to it in a more phenomenological kind of framework. The first thing is that, just to be clear, that Russie, in the sense I'm using it here, is not of the past. It's the occurrence of a telling in the present. That's the meaning of Russie in this context here, coming from this discussion in literature of difference between Russie and Histoire. So, with regard to the idea of rethinking Sartre's conception of dreams as Histoire and saying, well, let's be more precise. It's not Histoire, it's Russie, which is my suggestion. That's the idea that the dream is a telling that occurs to us in the present. It then becomes material in the past for a narration. So then there I would say that precisely because the Russie as a telling that occurs to you in the present, but it does not occur to you in the same present in which you are present of yourself as being present. Because the present that you are aware of yourself as being present is the present not only of a wakefulness, but the continuity, just going back to Europe, that I can make between I'm awake today and yesterday when I'm awake, I'm the same dude that I was, today, right? So the ability to establish that continuity of wakefulness through discontinuity, which is a central problem for, at least for Husserl's conception, because Husserl really deals with that, presupposes, when you think about dreams, this continuity of temporalities of experience which don't fit into that continuity, but also not outside of it, insofar that I cannot locate in the sequence of time when I dreamt yesterday. But I have a pretty good sense, at least immediately, maybe not when I'm 85 years old and I've got memory loss, but I know that, 3 days ago I was in Veracruz, and then I went to Jalapa, and then I went to Puebla. So there I would say what's interesting is that the Russie is not an Erzählung in that sense. It's not an Histoire, it's not a Geschichte, because it's not of the past. But on the other hand, the Russie then becomes material of the past, because I remember what I dreamt yesterday. And it becomes, to use your language, inexhaustible. Or not exhausted, I like the way you said it better, not exhausted by a single procedure. So not inexhaustible, but not exhausted by a single procedure. Namely, I can recount the dream I had to, Ignacio, and I can, Ignacio's like, oh, maybe it's this. And then I might think about it myself. And then I might go to my shrink, my analyst, when I go back to the U.S., and my analyst might have another interpretation. So that's the way in which that material is not exhausted by any single, so it's a Russie, the meaning of which is not exhausted by any single erzählung or any single narrative. That's how I would sort of fit that into the discussion of dreams in that sense. And again, that dreams are in a present, which is in a kind of different temporality than the temporality, or it's in a different now time. It's a different time state. Now here, to sort of capitalize on this idea of different temporalities, different times, whether it's, the threefold distinction of the past, of the present, of the future, however one, whether that's Erzählung or what have you. Here, maybe I would sort of switch to another philosopher, Husserl, who I think Husserl actually gives a framework to really make sense of that, so from a phenomenological point of view. And that's the idea that in a Husserlian conception, every structure of experience, whether I'm imagining something, I'm remembering something, I'm perceiving something, always constitutes a kind of temporal vector that then becomes, in his language, sedimentated into the past. So there is not one past behind me, there is multiplicities of pasts. Much as there's not one future in front of me, there's multiplicities of futures. And these multiplicities of past, Husserl himself, in the Bernauer manuscript, he has a diagram where he shows different lines. So there's a kind of pluralization of past that occurs, and which then are different forms of temporal stretches or temporal episodes that then, if you were to give texture to the sense of what it is to have a past. And these different temporalities are not simply of the past, but also, from a Husserlian point of view, there are different temporalities in the present. Because, for example, if I'm speaking now, there's a temporal unfolding of us speaking. I hear your words, I'm thinking about my thoughts, etc. But let's imagine that while I'm discussing, I'm also remembering a song that I heard yesterday on the radio. And I'm playing this song in my head. Now there's another kind of temporal object that's unfolding in my imagination. Because music, when you remember a song, you have to play it in your head. The new whatever album that came out, Olivia Rodrigo album. My 12-year-old absolutely wants to play it now. What?
The guitar? Olivia Rodrigo.
Yeah. Because Olivia Rodrigo recorded with Robert Smith of The Cure, and I'm a big Cure fan anyway. So if I'm talking to you now, early Cure is the best. If I'm talking to you now, and at the same time, because I can have, mind-wandering or concurrent episodes, I hear, the song that's stuck in my head. I can't get that stupid song out of my head. And then from a Husserlian point of view, let's imagine we're doing mathematics. So let's imagine we're trying to solve a mathematical equation. Mathematical objects are time objects. They have the temporality of omnitemporality. So that's the sense that even in the present, there can be different temporalities that then have to be coordinated within a unified experience, which is the experience of wakefulness here and now. So that's how I would say, in phenomenological terms, I would make sense of this suggestion of different temporalities and different times, though I think to the point that Ignacio made vis-a-vis Biltai, Husserl is still committed that there has to be a kind of process of integration, what he calls Einstimmigkeit in German, of all of these temporalities that occur. And maybe I'll just say maybe one more thing, especially with Schelling, about mythology. One of the things I find interesting about Schelling's interest in mythology, mythos, and the idea that nature has a kind of history that's not the history of the human Erzählung, not only in the first ages of the world, but in the lectures on Offenbarung, the idea that there is a kind of past that, in one sense, never happened, it's immemorial, but on the other hand, it only has a sense of something that happened, right? And that's the uniqueness of the notion of mythology. It's not something that didn't happen and therefore it's false. It's the immemorial, that which didn't happen, but conditions the sense of what it is that things have happened. And that's quite unique, I think, to Schelling. I'm not sure there's anything like that in the phenomenological, or at least in Sartre or in Husserl. I think that's a much more kind of intriguing idea in Schelling, under which he puts it the rubric of mythology.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I have a few remarks. But first, it's just two questions and one remark. Just a remark about Aristotle in a kind of very clerical way. And there's also a reference in the Barba Naturalia on the treatise on dreams. So Aristotle relates dreams to sensation, and he actually considers that there is a certain residue which is very intense on the impressions of the day that produces, that causes the dream. And this is just a remark, and he also links it at the end of the treatise with with remembering, when we wake up and we try to remember. And I would also just like to say something regarding imagination in Aristotle, as I understand it, and I've been working a lot on this subject and on this and for another article. It is that imagination has, as I understand it, a kind of intermediary role between sensation and intellection. And it is also in this context that we can understand when he says that the soul cannot think without phantasms. And these phantasms are not a copy of reality, it's just that we cannot think without producing certain images, say. And this is also interesting in his analysis of desire, that there is no desire without imagination. It's not imagination which is the efficient cause of movement, desire which is the efficient cause. But imagination presents one thing this way or another, a good or a bad. So this was just a remark about, especially regarding dreams.
Maybe I'll just say that I'll make a remark about that remark, since it's just a remark. You're absolutely right, but Husserl is a radical break with this Aristotelian framework. Because you're absolutely right that the Aristotelian conception of fantasia, in a sense, establishes a kind of schema, if you wish, to think about the concept of the imagination, really from Aristotle basically to Kant. The imagination is in between sense perception and thinking, and that the content of the imagination is originally from perception.
Yes.
Husserl breaks with that completely.
Yes.
And that's the that's the originality of Husserl, is to say, I'm going to think, this is already in the 1904-1905 lectures on Bewusstsein and Fantasia. Why? Because Husserl says it's a form of intentionality, which is irreducible to perception, but also irreducible to thinking. So there is thinking doesn't require images. Fantasia is not in between perception, and the content of imagination is not originally the content of perception.
Yes.
So there, it's the end of Aristotle's conception of fantasia. Yes. There you're absolutely right in reminding us what Husserl is not.
Yes, there's still a certain problem with Husserl. Well, I'll just say that, and we can, because I have also two other points. There's also a certain problem with Husserl that, okay, the interpretation actually is perception, but that, and not the perceptual apprehension. And it has an interpretation activity. Well, for Aristotle, it's actually imagination which does the interpretation thing, which presents things in such and such a way, which presents aspects of things. So here there is also a certain problem with Husserl and the relationship between sensation and perception. So.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that description of Husserl, but that's another discussion. I don't think that's Husserl what you described, but okay.
Same case, I just want to make this remark about the very practical remark about Aristotle regarding dreams related to perception. This is completely different from what Sartre and
Yeah.
Okay. Now, there is also this problem. So my kind of question also. asked if you said the difference between or debate regarding the total constitution of consciousness or the narrative constitution of consciousness.
Of self-consciousness.
Yes.
So not consciousness, but
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Or self, as they say, yeah.
Yes. And so finally, if we consider that there is a constructed continuity of the self, this is one of this is actually, I think, the problem. I mean, if we consider ourselves as a unity, and if it is a construction of some episodic, let's say, event, and we find or how can I say that? We arrive to this kind of continuity of the self.
So the debate about narrative theory of self and episodic is not strictly speaking about continuity. So it's also kind of a different emphasis than in Dilthey. It's not about continuity. It's about how to understand that the structure of the self is a structure of time. Structure of time is intrinsically divided between the past, the present, and the future. And the question is, how do you constitute the unity of past, present, and future as the structure of a self? So that's the problem. And then continuity is one way to understand that, but not the only way to understand that. Narrative doesn't necessarily imply continuity, right? I mean, on certain theories. And then there's a disagreement. I mean, there's also, I don't want to reduce everything to one thing, but, Ricoeur has a certain way to think about that. Arendt has a different way to think about that. But they all agree that the way to make sense of how consciousness is intrinsically temporal, that the unity of the three dimensions of time that structures a self ultimately has to be a narrative form. Now, then the other guys, so to speak, will say, well, no, like Husserl was one of them, will say, no, I'm going to show you that at the most basic level of consciousness, technically speaking, pre-reflexive consciousness, it's intrinsically temporal. It's what Husserl calls inner time consciousness. That structure involves the three dimension of time, retention, original impression, protension, to speak Husserlian. That constitutes a unity. It's experienced as a temporal passage of consciousness itself. There's a self-consciousness, which is pre-reflexive, but that is not a narrative structure. That just is the structure of inner time consciousness. So people like Galen Strawson and Dan Zahavi, I mean, and this I don't mean this meanly to them, they're people I know, they're friends, but they don't have the same sophistication as Husserl in explaining it. But they basically lean on someone like Husserl and Sartre and just say, look, there's a minimal self. The minimal self is episodic. It's temporal, but it's not narrative. So that's the terms of the debate.
Okay, so it's not necessarily reduced to a question of continuity.
No.
Okay. And
because again, I'll give you Husserl gives us the most sophisticated analysis. Again, I'm going to speak in very technical terms. This was a technical thinker. So the constitution of inner time consciousness of any lived experience, of any lived present, requires both the integration of the retention of the just now, the original impression, and the about to be, the protension, always marked by the discontinuity of the original impression vis-a-vis the retention and the protension.
okay.
So continuity always has to have the mark of discontinuity, otherwise I wouldn't experience every now as new.
Okay.
So continuity only makes sense through an irreducible discontinuity, which is the absolute newness of every now impression in Husserl's technical jargon. And the now impression is not the now as such, it's the consciousness of now in terms of which the now is constituted.
I have the impression that, in Ricoeur's analysis of Husserl in Time and Escape, he focuses and highlights specifically, you know, it says in a certain passage that this discontinuity of the now comes forth in this background of a certain of a continuity. I mean, I think that referred in his analysis of Husserl, he focuses mainly on the continuity implied precisely by the structure of retention, and before going from retention and distinguishing retention from recollection, if I understand right.
Right, maybe I'll just make a short comment because that will be another discussion to occur. But just terminologically, Husserl is very clear. The original impression or original presentation, as he calls in the Bernauer manuscript, is ein Schnitt, a cut.
Okay.
It's a cut in a manifold. So the fact that he calls it a cut means that it's a principle of discontinuity. So just terminologically, he's very consistent. It's a Schnitt in a manifold, and it's the constant cutting, if you wish. Each original impression is another Schnitt that cuts, and so to speak, and then produces these streams of retention and protensions.
Yeah, another way to put it, and in a simpler terms, is for Husserl, it's a continuity only if you understand it is a constituted continuity by synthesis. The problem the synthesis of time involves all that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a synthesis, but again, I think that it's an interesting argument that continuity is not presupposed, but continuity is always constituted through a discontinuity. That's kind of the innovative Husserlian argument, right? And again, I mean, you can, at the level of vocabulary, at the level of diagrams, and at the level of the concept, I think he's quite consistent in arguing that. And that's also why it's very different account than, it's very different than William James. Because William James has this idea that there's this kind of continuous stream of experience that then becomes cut. And it then becomes cut by acts of attention. So there's a constant flowing of streaming of consciousness. And then when I'm attending to you, when I'm doing to that, then I'm introducing these cuts that then... So Husserl sort of had read William James, or at least read the 2 books on memory and stream of time from Principles of Psychology. I mean, he didn't read the whole thing because it's a bit too long for him. But I think he inverts that kind of... he inverts it. And that's why I think it's continuity through discontinuity, though it's synthesis. There you're absolutely right.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I think it's Alberto first, and then Vladimir.
First of all, thank you for the amazing talk. And Hegel and Schelling have been mentioned here, so I think that it is missing the other race, ideally. And while I was listening to you about dreams, kind of imaginary, a form of imaginary or a reflective act, I couldn't help but think on Fichte. I think that there are 2 ideas in Fichte. One is the idea of imagination as a faculty, as a true faculty of spontaneity, and in this sense, as a faculty of the truth, because it is the faculty that gives the truth to the eye. And I remember that there is also this idea in his Doctrine of Silence, that dreams are creations of the eye. So I was wondering if there is a relation or there is an influence of Fichte's philosophy on Sartre. Because I haven't read Sartre philosophy of literature, so I am so ignorant about Sartre's philosophy. So this is my question.
Yeah, thank you. That's a fantastic question. So strictly speaking, there's no influence of Fichte, just as a kind of an empirical question. I mean, there's no influence there. So that's straightforward. No, there's no influence. I think that there is a kind of proximity. So you're absolutely right that Fichte sort of capitalizes on the idea of the productive imagination. Right, so the idea that the imagination is not reproductive in the way that it is for Aristotle, but now becomes productive.
This is a different relation to Kant.
Exactly.
Because for Fichte, imagination is the true faculty of spontaneity. It is not ostensible.
Exactly.
Like Kant.
Exactly. That's right. So I mean, we sort of anticipated what I was also saying. So Fichte takes this, this novel idea of the productive imagination, which in Kant is subsumed to cognition, right, in the schematism, and then emancipates it, if you wish, from cognition, as you said, and then makes dream, as you said, it's the creation of the I, it's the faculty. So there, I agree with everything you said about Fichte. So again, if the contrast to Sartre is, it's interesting that Sartre is not explicit about the idea that, on the one hand, clearly dreams are produced by the imagination. Dreams are produced by consciousness. But it's not clear that they're the creation of the I for Sartre. That's just unclear. Right? It's produced by consciousness, but it's not clear that it's produced by the I, if by the I you mean the self or awareness of oneself as an I. It's not a positing in that sense. That's right, it's not a reflective act in that regard. So in that sense, it's not the creation of the I. And then, so that would be, again, something quite different. And also here, I think that the Sartrean conception of spontaneity is different as well. The difference is that in a kind of interesting way, in Fichte, in a sense, the imagination as a faculty of spontaneity is another way to think about freedom, right? Freedom of the I. In Sartre, on the one hand, the dream is a spontaneous production of consciousness, but it is the, if you wish, ultimate illusion of freedom, because it is a consciousness that produces a consciousness that captures itself without being able to escape. Right? So it's the freedom to imprison myself completely in myself. So that's, in a sense, the freedom to fundamentally free from freedom by becoming hostage to myself. And the other metaphor that Sartre uses, which I didn't mention just because, I already spoke too long, I didn't want to speak longer, because Sartre, uses a lot of registers to describe phenomenologically the constitution of the dreaming, pure belief, like reading, etc. The other really important one is he says it's like incantation and being spellbound. It's magic, because as for those of you who are familiar with l'imaginaire, he uses the language of magic. The imaginary is a kind of magie. It's a kind of magic. So when you think of it in that sense, the dream is a kind of spell. I become fascinated by something that my consciousness has produced. The images that I see in the dream, I'm held hostage. I cannot but look at them. The only option is to look at them or to not dream. And so a dream is a kind of spell freely produced by consciousness that holds that very same consciousness held to that spell, as if a kind of evil witch, a malingénie, had captured me. And so that's the sense in which it's the ultimate unfreedom in that regard, even though it requires spontaneity. So it's a kind of spontaneity that thinks about unfreedom. And of course that's...
Yeah. Would you agree that dreams are products of spontaneity?
Yes, but in a different sense of spontaneity than in the case of Fichte.
Yeah.
but it's also part of this, the Sartrean idea. Again, he doesn't elaborate it in Imaginaire, but it comes clearly in Being and Nothingness, that, to put it quite dramatically, and maybe to overstate it, our freedom manifests itself most truly in the freedom to abdicate our own freedom, right? Again, I don't want to bring this to a no philosophical level, but this is the great song by Devo. Freedom of choice is what you want, but freedom from choice is what you need, right? That is the Sartrean philosophy in a song. That, we want freedom, but actually what we really want is freedom from choice, not freedom of choice. And so the imaginary is constantly the running away from reality, the freedom to not be free, and dream for him is the ultimate, what he calls enclosed consciousness. So it's an interesting notion of spontaneity. The relation between spontaneity is sort of turned on its head in that regard. And that's not very Fichtean in that regard.
Yeah, thank you.
Someone else? Vladimir, of course, and then Diana.
Thank you very much for your very interesting lecture. I just want to ask about lucid dreams. And I just want to...
Oh,
You always win.
I just want to ask if one of the main features of the essential structure of dreams and dreaming are that when I am dreaming, I don't be aware that I am dreaming, and if I become aware that I am dreaming, the most of the time I awake. But what happens when I become aware that I am dreaming, but I do not awake and have a lucid dream? Am I still dreaming, or am I now perceiving my dream? Or what happens when I have a lucid dream? Because you say that dreaming is the opposite of perception, because dreaming does not reveal anything. But if I have a lucid dream, what kind of dream do I have, or what kind of reflective consciousness, or what kind of perception do I have of that experience of have a lucid dream? And does reveals us or disclosure something, a lucid dream? I don't know if...
That's a great question. So Sartre does not directly mention or refer to the phenomenon of lucid dreams in his discussion, but he does talk about what are called hypnagogic images, which I think is how he would understand lucid dreams. So a French psychologist called Alfred Maury, M-A-U-R-Y, who was a late 19th century French psychologist, had published a book on dreams where he coined the term hypnagogic images. And hypnagogic images, according to Alfred Maury, and Sartre has a whole discussion of hypnagogic images. Hypnagogic images are sort of like images in the process of falling asleep. So you're not fully awake and you're not fully asleep. As well as images that flicker when you're half awake, half asleep. It's called, in English, it's called transitional mentation. So mental acts that occur in the transition of various sleep cycles. Because, as you know, dreams happen in a certain REM sleep cycles. So I think I'm just sort of imagining what Sartre would say to lucid dreams. He doesn't discuss it, but he discusses hypnagogic images. Because he says that hypnagogic images are different than dreams. I think he would understand, or would have to understand by his own framework, lucid dreams as a form of hypnagogic image. So dream-like experiences that you have in these sort of, in English I would say these sort of twilight moments of consciousness, or, as you know, I like literature a lot. I'll give you another reference. In Proust it's all over the place. You know, Proust, he's falling asleep, and he has these memories, he has these images. He's kind of awake because he can sort of talk to you about, not Proust the narrator, but Marcel the character. So I think that if we agree on the definition of lucid dreams, if a lucid dream is an experience of the imaginary in which there is a reflexive consciousness of oneself, that I am dreaming, then that would count as a hypnagogic dream or hypnagogic. And hypnagogic, it's a term that comes from the Greek, from dream, and at the threshold of dreaming, right? So I think that's how lucid dreams would have to be described phenomenologically from Sartre's point of view, because I think Sartre would have to insist that we have to make sure that we get our description of the category or the phenomenon of lucid dream correctly. What do we mean when we say, I am aware that I am seeing these images? The images not as act. If that means that I can think about other things, I can ask a question about it. I'll give you a famous example. As you know, Descartes had a series of dreams in 1619 while he was a soldier marching off to Prague. He was with the army of Maurice of Nassau because he was kind of a gentleman soldier just hanging out. Some people think he was a kind of spy for the Jesuits, but that's another story. But outside of Nuremberg, he had a series of 3 dreams, which he writes in a text called Olympias or Olympia. Freud had looked at them and said, they make no sense, I don't know what they're about. But in one of the dreams, he recounts these 3 dreams. In one of the dreams, if I remember correctly, Descartes narrates about how he's in a town that he doesn't know which town he's in. He's in the streets. It's very, very windy, and he's being pushed to the side, and he's forced into a church. And then in the next dream, some stranger in the street comes and gives him a melon. Not making this shit up. This is the dream. Yeah, so that's the But Descartes at least, when he recounts this dream, he at least claims or writes that during the dream he asked himself the question, what is going on? Because also, if I remember the first dream, he sees a book by an early medieval Latin poet called Ausonius, and there's a phrase in Latin saying, which path in life should I take, yes or no? It's from a series of poems by Ausonius, who's a very obscure but important Latin poet. He comes from Provence. And so Sartre claims or writes, he narrates and says, during the dream I was asking what this is about, etc., etc. And so if we accept that description at face value, that would have to be a reflexive self-consciousness. And so from a Sartrean point of view, one would have to say that's a kind of lucid dream. It's hypnagogic images, not narrative, because they're just a string of images. But also, at least for Sartre, not a récit, because he thinks these are just a pure sequence of images. On that note, I'll just mention it because it maybe harkens back to the question about Fichte. There's a really great paper by Jean-Luc Marion on Descartes' dreams. It's in the collection of, he has like 3 collections on his essays on Descartes. I think it's in the first or second one. Anyway, it's easy to find. And Marion makes an absolutely brilliant point. No, it's in a collection of his essays.
Okay.
So, but Marion makes a brilliant point which speaks to the Fichte thing. Marion says, when in the dream Descartes asks the question, what's going on here? This is what he calls the manifestation of reason That is the radical interruption of every experience, and that is the positing of freedom of reason, which then Marion says is exactly the conception of reason in the meditations against the malingénie. When the malingénie, which could also be a dream, and when Descartes says, I cannot be deceived, that I am thinking, that is a kind of pre-Fichtian moment where reason posits itself in its spontaneity of activity of the I. And Marion has the brilliant point, this is the affirmation of reason that interrupts every experience. That would be a kind of Fichtian moment, right? A kind of Fichtian moment. But again, just to get back, I just mentioned that because we talked about spontaneity and Fichte, because dreaming is also very important in the meditations, right? I'm dreaming that I'm here in front of the fire with a glass body, right? But just to go back to your original point, I think Sartre would think that is an example of lucid dreaming. And any account of lucid dreaming where you say lucid dreaming is I am aware that I am dreaming as opposed to me dreaming, that's how linguistically I would make the difference. There's the experience me dreaming, and there's the experience I am dreaming, or I know that I'm dreaming. If you say lucid dreaming is not just me dreaming, but I am dreaming, I'm able to know that I'm dreaming. If that's lucid dreaming, then that requires reflexive consciousness. Then that's not dreaming, that's hypnagogic images. That's the Sartrean argument, I think. Rightly or wrongly, that's the argument.
Okay, Diana, please.
Well, thank you so much. My question follows Arturo, and is whether we should specify following Jeanette that the distinctions regarding dreams, such as Repeat and Nicolas, are not absolute. In other words, if when I'm describing the dream I had last night, I say that I went to a waterfall and saw hundreds of colorful fish, and then I flew over the crater of a volcano, it is not as if the concept of time dissolves into total chaos. Within the very idea of a flow of dream experiences, there is an order that is not completely linear, but neither is entirely incoherent. What I mean is that both narrative forms occur within the flow of dream experiences, but alternatively. In my example, I don't know how or why I ended up at the volcano, but I do know that I swam before I flew. So I can explain in a linear narrative how or why that happened and stuff. But I do know that while I was swimming, I first saw a few red fish, then a bunch of yellow ones, and then just one blue. So how using both ideas can we explain the inner kind of the Oneiric phenomenon?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's complicated. So I'll just say a few things to parse out the many aspects of your observation of your question. The first thing is maybe just to re-emphasize that in my usage, so in the way in which I use this distinction of récit, narrative / histoire, to make sense of Sartre's hypothesis, what I find illuminating is a récit is the story that occurs. Calling attention to the fact of there being a telling. And that taking that idea, then to say what happens when we dream as a récit, as Sartre proposes, a story occurs to us. It happens to us. But this story is not constituted in the occurrence as a narrative. For among others, just to repeat myself, because there's no sense of what comes next. There's no unity of past, present, and there's no sense of this is about something. There's no implotment. So it's a kind of, in a sense, that's why it's a récit and not a narrative. So then, to your thoughts or questions, what then now becomes interesting, and I think that's what you're sort of describing, is, so again, I'll take a step back. So all experiences in the most basic level have to be constituted with a sense of sequence. Past, present, future. I mean, but the way in which then we'll see, but the fact that then we can establish different temporal relations of meaning, which are not just bound to sequence, that's going to be the achievement of narrative. And of course, that is the Aristotelian insight in the Poetics. It's achievement of narrative because it gives intelligibility which is not bound to the mere sequence of the events. And that's why, so narrative, just generally speaking, is the configuration of time that produces an intelligibility to human action, not bound to the sequence to which human actions are bound. And that's important because this is also kind of a Sartrean idea, though I didn't talk about it. This is in Sartre's play, No Exit, Huis Clos. That narrative gives us the promise of not being bound to death. Because the sequence of time, the fact that I am bound to the sequence of time is ultimately the fact that I am bound to death. I cannot undo the fact that yesterday happened yesterday, and that therefore there will be a tomorrow, and there will be a tomorrow in which I will die. So, and this is also the idea in the Arabian Nights. The Arabian Nights as narrative allows for unbinding myself temporarily to the boundedness of time, which is ultimately the boundedness of sequence. Mm-hmm. Sartre also explores this in Huis Clos in the play. And that's why all narrative is a struggle against death, to put it in those terms. So what that means is then back to that in dreams, you're absolutely right that and this also I think to Arturo to your idea that temporality unfolds in different temporalities. And here I would maybe push the point even further. No dream has the same temporality as any other dream you've had. Like you cannot say that this dream had the same temporality. I mean, of course, you can say it happened yesterday and not today, but the actual unfolding has a different temporality. And that temporality is one where it's, in a sense, almost always haunted, if you wish, by the not boundedness to any clarity of sequence. Because in your dream, or what you recounted, the fact that you remember now and you write down and tell me, oh, in my dream I first did A, then I did B, but maybe actually in the dream you did B and then A, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a sense in which, again, it's a récit, because it's a configuration of action. I mean, that's the other thing I didn't emphasize, that dreams are always about some kinds of action. Right? I mean, I'm happy to be corrected, but I've never had a dream where I'm just staring at a wall, right? Where I'm just like, like I've never had a dream in which my dream is, oh, I'm just really bored somewhere doing nothing, right? Something is somehow always happening, even if I'm not clear, and precisely I'm not clear what's happening, but something's happening. Though there's no sense that something is happening in the sense of I know what it's about. So that's a sense in which it's a récit and not simply a sequence. And precisely because it's a kind of pure récit that's not conditioned by sequence, because I can never really know whether the sequence in which I narrate the récit is the actual sequence of the récit, so to speak. And that's the tremendous variability, I like your formulation, that the dream as material, the dream of récit as material for narration cannot be exhausted by any single narration, by any single procedure, as you put it. And here I would add another thing, just to further make it interesting, your comment or your observation. I've had this experience, and maybe some of you had, about recurring dreams, right? Dreams where, I don't know, this has happened, and then maybe a month or two later, it recurs, like it's a similar kind of pattern. And that's also interesting, recurring of kind of different kinds of stories that then might also then refer implicitly to past récits. And then I think would be really complicated to understand how that works, right? How is it that there is this capacity for recurring dreams or recurring récits, and would have different temporal configurations, I mean, going to your point. And then to further add more complexity is there's also the phenomenon of what's called dream incubation. So dream incubation was something that, for example, in ancient Greek culture was a real praxis. Also in ancient Chinese culture, it's often written about in manuals about dreaming. Dream incubation is, I'm going to go tomorrow to the temple of Artemis, and I want Artemis to visit me in a dream because I want something to happen. I want to be successful in the hunt or whatever. And so I sort of programmed the dream that I want to have. I go to the temple because temples in Greece were sites where you have dreams where the gods would visit you. And that's called dream incubation. The idea is that, I sort of want this dream to be this way, and I prepare myself, I go through a ritual, and it's usually tied to some divination. So that would be also interesting, how does that work? That then, because that dream incubation is already kind of a story I'm telling myself, and then I want that to happen somehow. How is it that when I go to sleep and I'm not aware and I'm not constantly projecting a possibility because I'm asleep, nonetheless, there is what? And it's also not experienced as a remembrance. It's not, I remember that I want this. I do dream that Artemis comes down and, I don't know, does whatever Artemis does. So that would be also interesting about these different modalities of temporality of dreams.
Thank you.
Well, we have one more question.
I was thinking about, you mentioned that you can reserve imagination because I think about because they are only copy and information and they're not searching, they're not comparing, they're not reflecting anymore. So I was thinking, I thought before about the losing the creativity. I thought that they were losing the creativity, but I never think about they losing the imagination too. And the importance of having imagination because through imagination they can create or they can have creativity. So I was thinking if that happened the same as dreams, the students are losing the imagination they often dream.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really suggestive point. That and here the comment I made was just in English I would say on the fly, like I didn't fully think through what I was saying, but I think one could think through it and move in the direction that you're suggesting. That sort of I'll just sort of repeat again the point and then move to the direction that you're saying. That Sartre has this interesting account of reading, which actually in the context of French culture, it's kind of a dominant way to think about reading that involves the imaginary. Proust has a wonderful essay on reading, and if you remember in the beginning of Proust's novel, Côté de Chéchouan, Marcel talks about how he goes into the garden of his aunt and is always reading. So this idea is that reading, when I read words on the page, they are sort of prompting the exercise of my imagination and requires my act of creativity to produce the imaginary object. And then that also requires an exercise of energy, and therefore I experience fatigue. So there's a kind of energy exercise that has to be developed. And then there can be resistance, because I might not be able to understand exactly how to imagine. When I read the sentence, Madame Bovary is the famous example, that in Flaubert's Madame Bovary, in one scene, she's described as having green eyes, and in the next, later in the novel she has blue eyes. And so I could imagine, like, how do I make sense of that? Or how do I imagine the scene in which she's with Rodolfo in the carriage and whatever? So that requires an act of the imagination where I have to really interpret and understand what's going on and produce it for myself. And that's a form of creativity. That is also an experience of what Bergson calls, because Bergson has a similar idea, spiritual energy, where I experience fatigue. You know, I can't read all 3,000 pages of Proust's novel at once. And so you're absolutely right that that's also going to be connected to dreaming. That dreaming is also the capacity of the imaginary to produce stories or récits for itself that it experiences. And récits that are sort of removed from the programming of the world, so to speak. Because this is the paradox of dreaming for Sartre. It's a kind of moment of freedom where consciousness, I would say, sort of abstentiates itself from the world, but paradoxically in order to become hostage to itself. But it's that moment of abstentiation from the world that is important. And so I think you could say that, again, my suggestion is ChatGPT is the destruction of the imaginary, because it's the destruction of reading. And therefore, to your suggestion, also maybe not the destruction of dreaming, but the restructuring of dreaming, right? And here, this point maybe is not connected directly to your insight, but there's an absolutely fascinating book called Dreams Under the Third Reich, which was published in the 1960s, available maybe in Spanish. It's an amazing book by a German woman who, during the Third Reich, during the Nazi times, started writing down all the dreams that she had, and also started asking all her neighbors and stuff to tell her dreams. And what she tries to show is that in the context of totalitarianism, everyone is dreaming about Hitler and Himmler. That this is the absolute intrusiveness of totalitarianism ideology. That is this complete penetration into the imaginary, that there is no escape from the imaginary of Nazism, because of course it's a pure fantasy area, and all that nonsense. But that's the power of that system, if you wish. And it's an amazing book where she tells you all these dreams, and she then talks about how she asks people, why did you dream this? And you exactly the Third Reich of Dreams. It's a fascinating book. It's not exactly ChatGPT, but it shows you the example of how you have the complete colonialization of the dream world, of the intimacy of dreams, by the pure externality, in this case of totalitarianism, and maybe indeed now of, I don't know, maybe increasingly I'm only going to dream in emojis or something like that, right? That there's the way in which that's really how my imagination is going to start working. So I mean, that's a really interesting, fascinating question about what happens to the imaginary in the context of ChatGPT and other technologies of AI, which is not just about, knowing and intelligence, but perhaps even more importantly about, maybe the last thing I'll say, I know we're running out of time, but the other thing I would add to this, if we wanted to continue Sartre's thinking about the thesis that dreams are inherently stories, I think this connects directly also to the creativity of writing and a writer and artists. That I think he's also thinking, without being explicit, that this is the source of literature and creativity itself, right? I don't know if you know the Salman Rushdie book, Haroun and the Field of, what's it called, Haroun? And anyway, it's a wonderful story about a world in which there is no longer the capacity to tell stories. And then it's a kind of children's adventure of the last storyteller and his son, who then goes to the source of stories which could be, as Freud would call it, the navel of the dream, is the navel of all stories. So there's also, that could be the end of the literary imagination through ChatGPT and AI now writing novels and doing things for us. I think it's called Haroun and the Sea of Stories is the name of the Salman Rushdie, which is also, I think, a meditation or reflection on storytelling and dreams.
Well, I think we are running out of time, so we would like to thank you again for this wonderful talk.
Thank you for the discussion as well.
A very silent group. Thank you very much too.
There's this book from Bernard Lahire, I don't know how to pronounce it. He's a French sociologist, and has this book on sociological interpretation of dreams, and he quotes this book on dreams on the right. Yeah, it's Bernard, in Spanish it's Lahire. It's written like dreams.